Hello, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and for everyone joining us today. This is a university event that is sponsored. This event is called Is a University Colonial? Critical Conversations on its Present. This is part 2 of a 3-part series that is sponsored by the University of Connecticut's Office of Global Affairs and University of Nottingham's Institute for Policy and Engagement. Like to welcome everyone who's joining us. Speakers during this event will examine the role that universities have in cultivating racism and settler colonialism, the present challenges they face in disbanding unequal and oppressive narratives, as well as the future opportunities to contribute meaningfully to an anti-racist and anti-colonial agenda. My name is Kenny Nienhusser. I am an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. And once again, really happy that you are able to join us today. We have a great lineup of speakers who are going to be sharing around this really important topic that we have prepared for you today. To get us started, what I would like to do is welcome our keynote speaker, who's Councillor Leslie Ayoola from Nottingham City Council. Councillor Ayoola is one of the 3 councillors for Mapperley Board and presently the Executive Assistant for Regeneration and Safe Nottingham. He has a master's degree in Youth and Community Development and a BA in Business, which explains his passion for employment and entrepreneurship as tools to help communities grow. He has spent over 25 years working across the private, public, and voluntary sectors and has established a number of SMEs and social enterprises within the city, thus taking a keen interest in social entrepreneurship. He was subsequently a finalist in the Nottingham Social Enterprise Awards for Social Entrepreneur of the Year and Startup Social Enterprise of the Year in 2011. So he is a co-founder of Be Global, Nottingham's Black business network that seeks to support businesses to help them grow, thrive, and increase productivity in order to contribute to the local economy. So I'll pass it off to you, Councillor Ayoola, for your opening remarks, and thank you.
Thank you, Kenny, for your introduction. It was really great for that. And yeah, I just want to start by just thanking Institute of Policy and Engagement out here at University of Nottingham and also University of Connecticut's Office for Global Affairs for seeing it fit to invite me, to speak. Obviously, we've got a short amount of time, so I won't labour it any longer. But just a context, obviously, for me as being a local councillor for 5 years or so. Well, my key themes, what I like to work on and address is one is of like personal finance for people, the issues of race, which play a key role in the life of our communities, but also entrepreneurship as well, because entrepreneurship, in my perspective, and also social entrepreneurship, holds the keys to enabling people to get themselves out of poverty, to create a better life for themselves and their family. But I just wanted to start off as saying that universities themselves, and this question about whether universities are colonial in their outlook or approach, universities are powerful institutions themselves, and they make so much impact in our society, whether it's seen or unseen. So all around medicine, technological advancements, environmental, business and commerce. So they play a key role in the life of our society, and especially right here in Nottingham. But one of the challenges for me, as a councillor and as a person from the community, is how then we take that influence and that power and then link it to what the community actually needs at that point in time. So many universities tap into what was ERDF funding, European Regional Development Funding. Whilst that meets the needs of European Regional Development Fund, and sometimes universities does it always meet the needs of our communities? And universities themselves, and the way I see it, a massive influence on how we operate as local politicians, and then obviously moving on to national politicians, and the work that they produce to influence what we say and what we do as politicians is really key. And so we can't ever minimize that. But one of the things which I really would love to see more is that how universities can get involved in addressing inequalities, and this is past inequalities as well. It's obviously interesting, with the death of George Floyd and the constant battles that we have around the issues of race, US and the UK. Is the question for me was is the universities, or are the colonial, is looking at the structures? How are they structured? Where do they place their investments? Who do they align themselves with? Are they investing in their communities near or far? Now, we know with universities and also voluntary organisations, they use a number of tools to look at how they have an impact. And in the voluntary community sector, we had this tool which we used, which is called social return on your investment. So it looks at the investment that organisations place into an organisation and seeing what the outcomes and what the outputs. Now, if they can be very superficial, that's one thing, and it'll be like a tick box exercise. But I want to push universities and partners to say, how can we really make a massive difference? Here in Nottingham, we had some challenges around the issues of race and around Black communities being those of the highest unemployed over a period of time. And my challenge would be to say, okay, over the last 20 years, have those statistics ever changed? And we would like to say, partners around the table, what are we doing with all our intellect, with all of our skills, with all of our knowledge, etc.? How are we addressing those key points? Because not only would I say that obviously if we address the issues of economics, it benefits one particular community. What I always say is that, if we benefit one sector of the community, all of the community benefits, because to me, it's all about localism and how we can benefit. And my last point would be that, coming into the era of coming to the end of a year where the UK made the decision to leave the EU, and Brexit's on our doorstep. What is the university's relationship going to be like with those developing countries? What I wouldn't like to see is colonialization Mark II, or a real development relationship with partners, say in the continent of Africa and the Caribbean, and how we can really benefit both communities and come in as equal partners to address some of those challenges. So my point would be rather to throw it out to the professionals and the experts like yourself to discuss this question, but the challenge and the plea for me as a local politician trying to address issues on the local and local levels. How can you help us address the local issues of people's personal finances, of people's wealth, and addressing some of those challenges so that we can in turn around help universities and local communities. Thank you.
Wonderful, great. Thank you so very much for those very interesting keynote remarks, and for having us think about the central role that universities can have in what you call making these massive differences. And our panelists will certainly address that really important question. So thank you for getting us started and thinking about this. What I'd like to do now is introduce our panelists very briefly, and then ask if they can go ahead and provide a little bit more information about themselves, as well as provide their opening remarks for about 6 or 7 minutes that they'll have to please go ahead and provide their opening remarks. So I'd like to first introduce Dr. Mark Overmeyer-Velázquez. He's a professor of history and Latinx studies and director of the Hartford campus at the University of Connecticut. Second person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Onyeka Nubia. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, teaching at the University of Nottingham, and a visiting research fellow at Edge Hill University and University of Huddersfield. Our third panelist is Dr. Gina Higginbottom, Emeritus Professor, Ethnicity and Health at the University of Nottingham. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Dana Francisco Miranda. He's Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Affiliate Research Scholar in Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. So in that order, I will ask each of our panelists to please introduce themselves a little bit more deeply than I have and provide their opening remarks.
Muy buenas tardes, good afternoon. Make sure you can hear me okay. Great. My appreciation to Malik and Zara, Jane Gordon, and Kenny for organizing this event. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with my colleagues from UConn, University of Massachusetts, and the University of Nottingham. Councillor Ayoola's comments were brilliant and fit well with what I will be saying in my brief remarks here, which I'll be reading. I'd like to begin by acknowledging, although this is a virtual event, the land on which UConn resides is the territory of Mohegan, Pequot, Scotticoke, Golden Hill, Pagusset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples, who have stewarded our land, this land, throughout the generations. And I think while it's always critical to articulate this land acknowledgement, it's all the more relevant today for this panel, as I'll mention, and our discussion of colonialism and the university. So in my very brief and somewhat fragmented presentation, I begin with a theoretical overview of the topic, move to some broad historical and then UConn-specific contextualization, and then conclude with a discussion of praxis and urgent and critical efforts to decolonize higher education on the campus, where I serve as the academic and administrative leader. I agree that the university is colonial, and it is and can be a space of decolonial resistance and change. So while my focus here is on universities in the US and my own institution in particular, global and transnational circuits of power are constitutive dimensions of coloniality's relationship to the emergence and perpetuation of the university. Specifically, Euro/colonial-centric notions of knowledge construction and of knowers/students persists in the American university. As is the case in my institution of higher education, these imperial constructions forged from notions of racialized power are pronounced in the relationship between a predominantly white Maine metropolis in Storrs, which is in a rural part of our state, and its quote-unquote diverse regional outpost here in Hartford, which is one of the state's larger cities. I've entitled this presentation Decolonizing the University, Encuentros, Desencuentros, and the Public Good. And I'll put that title in the Q&A so people can see it. I use a Spanish language term encuentros or encounters, and the difficult to translate term desencuentros or alienations or failed meetings, following Mary Louise Pratt's notion of contact zones, or as social spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations of domination and subordination, like colonialism, slavery, or their aftermaths as they are lived out across the globe today. So the case of my campus, UConn Hartford, is an example of the encuentro and desencuentro of a predominantly white institution encountering and then, I would say, missing an opportunity to interact with a predominantly Black and Latinx student and urban community. So UConn Hartford's 3,500 students and 300 faculty and staff work and learn in the 80+% Black, Brown, and immigrant city of Hartford, the capital of the Native American origin named state of Connecticut, in the colonial named region of New England. And here I'm using Michelino Semblaya's definition of decolonization as a concept that generally highlights two important ideas. First, it evokes a historical narrative that resists Eurocentrism and acknowledges the contributions of colonized populations across the globe. And second, it emphasizes a moral imperative for righting the wrongs of colonial domination and an ethical stance in relation to social justice for those people enslaved and disempowered by persistent forms of coloniality. This past summer, in the height of national Black Lives Matter actions to protest violence against Black bodies, a crowd of mainly Hartford youth and students rallied for racial justice in the space in front of our campus and next to City Hall. Pablo, a queer Latinx UConn Hartford student, led one of the chants opposing police oppression, claiming the city university space for people of color and demanding recognitions and rights. Pablo's story serves to ground my discussion of the colonial university in its particular political and local context, its impact on the health and lives of our students, and underscores why we need to recognize so-called peripheral youth and community leaders of color as central actors building on a long history of decolonizing knowledge, power, and the university. Pablo's story also needs to be contextualized in its larger history. So like the United States, the University of Connecticut involves simultaneous narratives and practices of colonialism and resistance. These encuentros and desencuentros have shaped the university's present relationship with scholarship and the communities in which it resides. In 1862, the US federal government passed the Land Grant College or Morrill Act to provide grants of land estates to finance the establishment of colleges. That same year, the Pacific Railroad and Homestead Acts further enabled white settlers access to occupy Native American lands. Connecticut became the third state to accept the Morrill Act's provisions, from which it continues to benefit. Academic histories of UConn have perpetuated older frontier tropes that begin with the arrival of white founders and erase the existence of Native Americans. My colleague at UConn, Dr. Glenn Matoma, is currently resisting the details of this act and will give us some more information on that in the months to come. So once university elites conceded to social pressures to allow women and racialized minorities access to institutions like UConn, resistance to genocidal, white supremacist, legislative, and narrative practices became a parallel existence in US higher education. Student demands resulted in the development of ethnic and anti-racist studies and culturally relevant spaces for them. From civil rights era protests to contemporary advocacy for undocumented immigrants, student activists and staff and faculty working in allyship have challenged efforts to assimilate minoritized students and instead advance progressive change. These contrasting desencuentros challenge the allegedly commonplace notion that a core mission of land-grant institutions is that they serve the, quote, public good and are the, quote, social conscience of American society and its educational system. However, as my colleague Frank Tuitt and others argue, the opposite has been true. Quote, higher education institutions designed from colonial and neo-colonial structures and policies were never intended to be for public good, but for private gain to maintain white supremacy. The colonial nature of the desencuentros is perpetuated in its neoliberal economic incarnation, where 3/4 of all faculty in the United States are contingent laborers. A disproportionately high amount of them come from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups that operate in what Tuitt and others have called a system of, quote, plantation politics, a structured and complex bureaucratic network of exploitation, domination, expropriation, and extermination. Some concluding thoughts. As witnessed in Pablo's demands for justice and equity, these enduring colonial systems cause inequities and violence. To support the mental, physical, and intellectual health of our students, faculty and staff at the university and my campus in particular needs to decolonize its systems of hierarchy and power. At UConn Hartford, with our students and with members of the surrounding Hartford community in which we exist, we have begun what will be a long, challenging effort to co-create a new vision and mission that centers anti-racist decolonial concepts and practices, drawing on collaborations with students like Pablo and lessons from US ethnic studies. As a site of decolonial thinking and pedagogy, we work with members of the community and our colleagues in disciplines such as public policy, urban studies, and social work to reinvigorate a mission to be an institution for the good of the public. So I'll conclude there, and we'll be pleased to provide examples in the discussion of our efforts at Decolonizing UConn Hartford at the mutually constitutive intersection of teaching, research, and community collaborations. So thank you and muchas gracias.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Overmeyer-Velázquez, for those opening remarks. Now, I'd like to virtually hand it off to Dr. Onyeka Nubia, who is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, teaching at the University of Nottingham, and a visiting research fellow at Edge Hill University and University of Huddersfield.
So the key thing that I wanted us to look at, we talk a lot about the nature of colonialism, i.e. what is colonialism? And I don't think we can talk about decolonizing colonialism until we actually expand on what. So colonialism is a time or a motion or a methodology whereby your body, your soul, and your emotions that are attached to your soul are no longer your own. It's like a disease infects and makes your body work for you, work for them. And so that you can no longer function for your own self-preservation, for your own continuation, or your own development. You are working now for the disease that has inhabited your body. That's what colonization is. It infects all capacity which would otherwise be natural. So I believe all human beings have an instinctive capacity for self-preservation, and I think in some ways community preservation, and have a direct relationship with the land in their own natural sense. Colonization robs the individual of their instinctive natural capacity. Now, in this country, universities have institutionalized this destruction. They have been laboratories for disease creation. They have been scientific manufacturers of the reproductive methods of destroying self-preservation, of destroying intellectual capacity, of destroying the ability of individuals to think for themselves in a way in which develops themselves. The very nature of the institutions in this country have been created on that foundation. It's not a question of they have become it. It is that they are fundamentally it. Now, how do we overcome this? This is a major thing. Because if an institution is fundamentally addicted to something, how do you get the institution to go through cold turkey? How do you create a cure for something that's so endemic and something that's so pandemic? Well, the answer is that you have to work on the basis of destroying the basis of that colonization. Now, it's difficult because universities have become institutions that are also businesses. And big business has a large part to play in the way in which institutions function and the way in which institutions develop their practices. The high-sounding moral agenda around equality, diversity, and everything else has at its core a pound sign or a dollar sign. Where does the money go? Unfortunately, the money goes towards maintaining the status quo. Moreover, the students that attend institutions, we may feel that they're in some way at the vanguard of some revolutionary change for decolonization. They are not. The students that attend British institutions, for the most part, want a degree so they can go into business. They don't want to become historians, social enterprise activists, educationists. Some do, but the vast majority don't. They want a course that is certified in a Russell Group institution that will enable them to earn £40,000, £45,000, £50,000 at the end of the year. Now, how, faced with these challenges and an increasingly conservative academia, can we negotiate change, especially when the very faculties that determine intellectual veracity, these faculties being research institutes, historical periodicals, scientific periodicals, run automatically and almost completely by those within a very narrow demographic of human activity, who determine what is intellectually okay, who determine what is intellectually satisfying, who determine what is intellectually sharp. These individuals still promote colonization. So I question whether we are actually committed to decolonization. I question it. I question it because I do not believe that we actually understand what it means. I question it because I do not think that we understand that it means each of us as individuals decolonizing our Eurocentric mentality. And it also means that we have to have the courage to put our jobs on the line. Yes, I said our jobs on the line, our careers on the line, and our reputations on the line to affect change. Change was never brought about except by doing all of those things. And if we are not willing to do those things, then we will bring about no change.
Great, wonderful. Thank
you,
you, Dr. Nubia, for those very provocative remarks and challenging us to really think if we are committed to decolonialization in our societies and in our universities. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Gina Higginbottom to provide her opening remarks. She's an emeritus professor of ethnicity and health at the University of Nottingham.
Thank you very much. I'm Gina Ayoola Higginbottom. Thank you for inviting me this evening. I'm absolutely thrilled to be taking part in the second of the series, which is really focusing on the present. I'd like to say a huge welcome to the international audience, a kwaba to the audience. I've been fortunate to work at the University of Nottingham, but I've also been fortunate to work at the University of Alberta for 8 years as a Canada Research Chair. And as you know, Canada is a former colony of the UK. I'm also been blessed to have one Ghanaian parent, a parent who was born and raised in a colony, and I'm one parent who is British. So through these primary determinants, I've been able to reconfigure my own personal history vis-a-vis the history I was taught in schools. And I think I'd like to commence by saying it's automatic that every individual, every institution in the United Kingdom has benefited from colonialism and the profits from the vile and abhorrent transatlantic slave trade. In order to move forward, we need to deconstruct and confront our history and establish the ways in which these historical events permeate our contemporary institutions today. And that includes institutions of higher education. For example, I'm a resident of the city of Birmingham in the UK. It's the UK's second city. The city has undoubtedly benefited from its connections to the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, as it produced a vast array of metalwork, ironwork, guns, chains, and manilla, the currency of the trade, used for a worldwide system of human exploitation. Whilst the ports of Bristol, Liverpool, London's connections are widely acknowledged, the larger industrial cities of the UK's connections are somewhat opaque, and the same may be argued for our universities. Colonialism and slavery shaped and determined contemporary Britain, fueled the Industrial Revolution, and our institutions are imbued with the legacies. To the best of my knowledge, there is only one UK university that has publicly acknowledged and researched their colonial past and their connections with the transatlantic slave trade, and that is the University of Glasgow. Although the University of Cambridge has research underway and the Universities of East London and Newcastle have made public statements regarding these connections. In July 2016, the University of Glasgow Senior Management Group of the university issued a landmark statement, and I quote, The University of Glasgow acknowledges that during the 18th and 19th century, it received some gifts and bequests from persons who may have benefited from the proceeds of slavery. Income from such gifts and bequests have been used in supporting academic activity undertaken by the students and staff of the university. This university commissioned a report into slavery abolition and the connections of the University of Glasgow, and this report is publicly available on their website. The university has records of approximately 200 endowments, bursaries and prizes, approximately 2,500 donations. Estimating the contemporary value of these historic gifts is complex, but it is clear substantial sums were used to facilitate the growth and the development of the university. And the sum is estimated to be 198 million in current terms. And during this period, a new campus was constructed, the Gilmore Hill campus. The University of Glasgow has taken steps towards amelioration via a number of strategies. I cannot go into all the strategies this evening. You would need to go to the website and take a look at the report, but they are attempting to make amends. Let's fast forward into the 21st century and our educational arena. The UK Equality Challenge Unit, now called Advanced Higher Education, tell us that in the higher education institutes, we have to contend with something termed the attainment gap. And the attainment gap is the issue that there continues to be a considerable gap between the proportion of white British students receiving first-class honours degrees compared to the UK domiciled students from minority ethnic groups. Just to say, I'm giving the exemplar of first-class honours degrees, but the attainment gap exists at every level of assessment in higher education. In 2015-2016, data showed us that black students, well, 50.5% of black students had an attainment gap of 28.3% compared to their white counterparts. So this is a considerable difference, and most UK universities' figures would be in the double figures. Advanced higher education go on to explain to us the consequences and implications of this. Many graduate level jobs and postgraduate courses and related bursaries have a requirement of a 2.1 degree or above as a minimum entry requirement. That includes some Ph.D. courses. This means that minority ethnic graduates are less likely to benefit from these opportunities, which impacts upon the job market and the academic pipeline. Minority ethnic students comprise 20% of the student population, and this figure is likely to increase with changing demographics. With fees to consider, these students are going to expect higher education institutes to demonstrate that they are addressing the attainment gap and they have taken race equality seriously. If students have not had a positive experience of higher education or feel they have not been allowed or encouraged to fulfill their potential, they are less likely to want to become academics themselves. And this is at a time when UK higher education needs to increase the pool of minority ethnic academics. For example, at the moment, 0.6% of black women achieve a professorial role in the United Kingdom. And 1.2% of mixed race women like myself achieve a professorial role. So why has this scenario persisted? Well, simply put, our universities remain colonialist in their pedagogical endeavours without active, deliberate, focused deconstruction of the curricula and pedagogical processes. Our universities will remain colonialist. And this is not simply our organisational structure. Learning is facilitated by human beings who are subjected to and socialised into a Eurocentric history in their own education. Our national curriculum does not currently provide a comprehensive and thorough view of the UK's engagement in colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. which was sanctioned by every echelon of society since Elizabethan times. We had the Royal Africa Company and we had the Royal East India Company. The Eurocentric historical lens by which many individuals view university structures, pedagogy, and indeed students mediates their interaction. It is this paucity of knowledge and evidence in our own learning that sustains these colonialist perspectives that form and determine the organisational cultures of our UK universities. And we are all part of the organisational culture, and we all contribute to its ideological stance. In this sense, decolonisation of the curriculum is not enough. Decolonisation of the entire faculty and support systems is necessary. Because I'm a health professional, much of my academic life is focused on the health and education of health professionals, and I would like to end with a brief exemplar. My assertion is that most university curricula in the UK are formulated for health professionals to enable them or prepare them for caring for a white population. There is little, if any, focus on preparing practitioners to meet the diverse needs of our pluralistic society. I would challenge you to ask any medical academic facilitator of learning how they teach the recognition of physical clinical signs and symptoms in people who have black and brown skin. How do they recognise inflammation, cyanosis, gangrene, jaundice, erythema in black or brown skin? For example, if you are a practitioner working in London, more than half your population will have non-white skin. And in some London boroughs, more than 90% of the population will have non-white skin. Therefore, how can you be appropriately prepared to care for the populations you serve if you cannot recognise these physical clinical symptoms in black and brown skin? And that's quite aside from any other ethno-cultural or religious dimensions that might impact upon the therapeutic care delivery process. In the UK, we currently have appalling statistics, which mean that black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than their white counterparts. How many of these women had central cyanosis that our university prepared doctors, nurses and midwives could not recognise because they had black or brown skin? In summary, yes, I contend the university is presently still colonialist based on the evidence I have articulated.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Higginbottom, for those great opening remarks that you presented us with, and having us think about how universities have and continue to benefit from our colonial past, and then thinking about the University of Glasgow and how we can learn from them to be able to think about how to give an introspective examination around how we could begin to do this important work. So thank you for those remarks again. I'd like to go ahead and hand it off to Dr. Dana Francisco Miranda, who is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Affiliate Research Scholar in Philosophy at the University of Connecticut, to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you. I'll try to keep my remarks shortly, but I do want to thank everyone for engaging in this conversation, the Q&A questions. I've been reading them on the side while people have been presenting. I'm very fortunate to be here. As people have discussed the coloniality or the colonialism within both past and present forms of education, particularly higher education, I want to take a particular focus. So with regards to the past colonialism regarding colleges and universities, I think it's pretty easy to see the connections with slavery, with colonialism, with imperialism, whether we look at the formation of colonial schools in the Americas, in Africa, Asia, throughout the world, really, or even in a famous debate, the Valladolid debate between Bartolomé Las Casas and Juan Sepulveda, which again was taking place at the San Gregorio College, a university setting, where these two individuals are debating not only do indigenous people have souls, but is the colonization of the New World appropriate? is enslavement of indigenous people appropriate? If not, can we enslave other people, i.e. Africans? So universities have been part of colonialism or colonial projects and imperial projects for a long time. Again, the Ayoola debate took place in 1550. So almost a 200-year connection between these points. But I also want to focus not only on curriculum, not only on the funds institutions have received through colonization and enslavement, or the present day investments they currently make that are colonial in nature. I really want to focus in a sense on graduates, so students. So when we're talking about the coloniality of education in our present, it's not simply enough to talk about how the curriculum is Eurocentric or doesn't acknowledge present knowledge systems from other people across the world. It's also not enough simply to say that the faculty and staff or administrators have to have a decolonizing framework, because again, I think they don't have a good sense at all times of what this actually means, what it should actually be directed at. Because again, decolonization is not presently used mostly, at least in the United States. There's still the diversity and equity and inclusion model. There's still multiculturalism. I still think they predominate over decolonization model. However, when we start using the term coloniality, colonization, colonialism, decolonization, we're able to, again, look at students, say, what type of people do they produce? What type of education? So it's not simply about accreditation, it's not simply the degree, but what type of students are we putting out in the world and how are they influencing society? And so Anna Julia Cooper, in her work, A Voice from the South, but particularly her last chapter, What Are We Worth?, really dives into this question where she proposes a new pedagogy. And this new pedagogy really simply states that an institution is going to be judged by what sort of men and women or people they grow or turn out, what they produce. And so she calls institutions in a sense of factory, that you're having individuals' material being brought in and you're meant as an educator to give value, to shape it. So what you turn out is something of worth. And so for this question, this pedagogy, it's about returning to the question of colonialism. What have institutions of higher education turned out repeatedly over 500 years? What societal implications, what societal reproductions have they turned out? And for me, it's still a colonial relationship. It's still a relationship where knowledge systems, if they're not Eurocentric, are devalued or siloed or segregated into area studies where not everyone has to participate. And this isn't only in higher education. It's about curriculums that, again, aren't really preaching a fuller world. It's not showing the diversity of opinion, of beliefs, of thought processes. It's, again, meant to be Eurocentric. It's meant to uphold. So in the United States, you don't really get discussions of settler colonialism, even though the US is founded as a settler colonial site. You're not having these discussions with students unless they take particular courses geared towards those topics. But again, as Mark mentioned in his presentation, just naming the people that have stewarded this land, that are still alive, that are still questioning the coloniality of the United States, can be dismissed as non-crucial knowledge. But once we actually get into, well, if we're meant to produce certain students, if we're meant to produce students that are meant to decolonize not only the institutions of higher education, but also the societies that they live in, I'd say at the moment, there has been failure on the part of educators. Not all of this are educators' fault. Again, we don't, as much as people talk about shared faculty governance, there's a lot of pressure on educators, on professors. But at the same time, if we're committed to decolonization, I think we're confronted with certain issues. If we are meant to break these colonial relationships to create students that also do the work of decolonization, not simply how we do our pedagogy, not simply how we do our research at the institution, but to have our students have an impact on the world to break on these relations, I think it's good to, again, ask the simple question. So here I'll keep it relatively brief, but it's about, for me, a confrontation between two models. And it's a model that I'm always constantly debating, because as an educator, I thoroughly believe in the processes of learning. I believe that you, as an educator, as a professor, you can help students learn about their relationships with the world and show them that there's more ethical relations. There's ways in which they'll graduate, and even though they're adults, they'll be more part of their political world and can have an impact and change it for the better. But I also question whether universities are committed to that process. If universities, as currently articulated, can be decolonized, or to be, I think, more appropriate, can engage in acts of decolonization or decoloniality, again, this ongoing process of challenging themselves. So for me, the question is always between abolition and decolonization. And so to put it briefly, I believe universities have been foundational to the modern world. Again, there's been an over 500-year history of universities not only creating research, but also creating students that have been colonizers, colonialists, that have engaged in works of imperialism, but that have also done the work of decolonization, particularly in the 60s and 70s. So if universities have been central to modern life, have been central in terms of accreditation processes, getting individuals jobs, one thing I ask is, if this process of accreditation, of learning, of knowledge, of producing men, as Anna Julia Cooper would say, has also been colonial, has reintroduced and reaffirmed certain structures, then what is meant to survive of the university? I think that has always been the question I've been confronted with. So when we're talking about decolonization, even when we're talking about multiculturalism or diversity and inclusion, if we're really meant to change the institution, to change larger society, what is meant to survive? If learning can take place across many different models, what is unique about the university that I myself am invested in? Is it simply a job that it gives me entitlements that I prefer? Or is there something unique about a university setting that can't take place under other learning models that I want to keep intact? And so for me, at the present moment, the reason why I don't call for the abolishment of universities or colleges as is because I'm still working through the process of decolonization. I'm committed to my students, I'm committed to my research, and I'm saying that I need to actually go through the process. I can't say decolonization is impossible unless I actually try to work with not only students, but other faculty to decolonize the university. And so taking on both E. Tuck and K. Wayne Yang's position that decolonization is not a metaphor. Rather, it has to deal implicitly with certain features that I just want to highlight briefly. So Tuck and Wang highlight in their paper that decolonization must include, particularly in the Americas or even in Africa and other places, a repatriation of indigenous land and life. It's not simply about changing curriculum, it's about returning both indigenous land to its people, but also allowing for their ways of life to flourish and be part of our common life. I do think that that must be highlighted. I also think that universities should engage with national liberation projects, do the work of cultural transformation, building off of Frantz Fanon, do the work of repossession or disalienation. And lastly, wealth redistribution. So universities, particularly in the United States, do the work of gentrification, do the work of not only taking land from indigenous people and failing to have conversations about return, but as what I call landlord and masters. Again, many of the universities, particularly in cities, own the land, own the buildings where students, graduate students live. And as landlords, they have that institutional power to not only do return, but engage in a different relationship, a monetary relationship. But with all that being said, because decolonization for me includes all those processes, I will readily admit that universities are highly resistant to these charges. One thing we can do, though, is articulate what we actually want through the process of decolonization more. So as I mentioned, the university has a choice. it can amend not only past harms, but also present harms in terms of investment, in terms of returning land in the case of the United States. If we're talking about returning bodies. So the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act has highlighted that many universities in the United States have indigenous bodies, ancestors in their possession and are failing to return it to indigenous people because it's in their museums, and they value that form of knowledge more than they value a certain type of relationship. And I think in the UK, we can also talk about colonial museums or imperial museums and the failure of return. It's a failure to engage in a certain type of relationship that I would call decolonial. So right now, I'm engaged in the process of not only mapping out what I think decolonization would look like in higher education, but really demanding that this actually must be done. Decolonization can't simply be a metaphor for making things better. Because I think if we look at diversity and inclusion, if we look at multiculturalism, it's been ways of not really changing any material conditions, but trying to have a better framework or better PR, as I'd say. So with that, I think, again, decolonization is a possibility, but we must always caution this against the question of abolition. If we're really committed to learning and that knowledge reproduction and circulation, there are other models for that. So if we're invested in the university, it actually has to be for a reason other than simply our jobs. So thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Miranda, for those very thoughtful remarks and really sort of having us think about how truly committed higher education institutions are around trying to decolonialize our institutions. So what I'd like to do is encourage audience members to present questions through the Q&A box. We're going to do our very best to get through those questions as best we can. So I encourage you to go ahead and do that. But I'd like to begin with a question for all our panelists. We have a very diverse array of disciplinary training that we have here in the panel, which is great. So I'd like to begin with us thinking, and if you wouldn't mind sharing some thoughts on what ways that your disciplinary training and your study has informed your thinking about and or decolonization work that you do at your institutions. So I'd like to begin with Dr. Overmeyer-Velázquez, please.
Thank you, Kenny, and thanks to all my colleagues for your brilliant insights. I guess I'd start with saying that this notion of decolonizing knowledge is nothing new to academia. That my colleagues have said, we could draw on Fanon, Said, Spivak. I think in my own field of Chicanx, Latinx studies, borderland studies, these kinds of interventions have been around for many, many, many decades. And so it's on their shoulders that I've been trained in U.S. ethnic studies, history, and what we call in Latin America, pensamiento crítico, kind of critical thinking or critical knowledge tradition that kind of pulls on this notion that Walter Mignolo talks about around geopolitics of knowledge, that is deriving the production of knowledge from particular locations and locales, and asking questions about who's producing knowledge, where, and to what end, right? Again, going back to all the comments that were made before, and what happens typically is this kind of perpetuation of these power inequalities and the perpetuation of the colonizing of the university. U.S. ethnic studies emerges in the civil rights period as from activist students largely and some faculty emerging and demanding space for their own voices and their own thinking and positioning themselves. And it makes me think about what Dr. Nubia said about the kind of the body as colonization as this kind of disease that occupies the body. And so those attempts in ethnic studies were sort of a cleansing and reclaiming of voice and body within these spaces, which is really critical. I think also about efforts in critical Latin American studies around what we call the otros saberes, or other knowledges or other Americas, is collaborative research, working with people in community, indigenous groups alongside academics to co-create knowledge. So decentering the university as the only place of knowledge construction, and the process of unlearning or the ununiversity, those kinds of things. How do we work with people in our own communities to imagine and then create new knowledges that support them? And again, getting back to my presentation around what is the public good and who are the public, I think is really important. The challenge, of course, is that ethnic studies in the US, as people like Maldonado and others have talked about, while it's a space of resistance, it's also a space that's been marginalized at the university. It's been seen as a kind of bastard space, right? A space with less value. And so kind of partitioned off to the side and been, if anything, kind of a space where you can take a couple, like Dana said, take a couple courses here or there, but not integrated into the deeper curricula and ways of thinking. And of course, that lends itself to a whole range of things around promotion and tenure and who's hired and who's not hired at the university. So those are the challenges. So not making it just this question of diversifying the faculty, but rather thinking critically about the kind of knowledge that's produced based from these very difficult questions. Anyway, that's one answer I have to this question.
Thank you. That was very eloquent response. I work in a very, very contested field. I'm an early modern English historian and a medievalist. That's my thing. So I spent the last 31 years studying medieval English history, the Tudors, the Stuarts. That's my thing. So it's an area or two areas of history that are a white enclave, not just a white, but in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of Oxford, Cambridge educated people. These are their exclusive preserves. And they're also the cornerstone of what we think about in terms of the English historical narrative. And of course, the English historical narrative is the bedrock of the British colonial narrative, because one is built upon the other and one's the foundation for the other. I work, and I've been working for the last 31 years in local history. So that's even a more decentralized version, which looks at what was happening in local English parishes in 1501 or 1502 or 1524 or 1564 or whatever. And it is absolutely fascinating, because by me going through these processes for the last 3 decades of that kind of evidence gathering, research gathering, I've been able to deconstruct the English project from its core, from its root, not just from a political post-colonial perspective, Fanon Emir Cesar perspective on the outside looking in, but from the inside out, to do what colonialism does to the colonial people, but from the opposite way. So I've deconstructed Englishness, deconstructed Britishness from the revelation of what white English people said about themselves and what people of African descent, other people of color present in England and Britain said about itself, about this nation. So this is very, very dangerous stuff, because what I'm doing is I'm using the words of the English people to deconstruct Englishness, and then adding the perspective that because England was an ethnically diverse country which had not yet developed its racialized perspective in the way in which it later did at the end of the 17th century. Because of this, the very basis upon which almost every curricula, be it anthropology, history, mythology, classics, philosophy, the way in which all of those subjects are taught are fundamentally wrong, not just from a political perspective or a social justice perspective, although it is that too, but from a evidential perspective, on the basis of evidence, by deconstructing the very definition of identity upon which all these things are based upon. So the challenges that I faced have been absolutely immense, from every single sector that one could imagine. They are daily, they are weekly, they are monthly, they are yearly. They are attacks upon my pedagogy, upon my curricula, upon my professionalism, upon me as an individual. Sometimes they're even physical, although that's died down less. It comes from a faculty that's thinking about the bottom line. And even though I have supporters there, it's still difficult. It comes from an essentially white student population who do not want to learn this information. And I would question this notion that people have that the core demand for decolonization is coming from the student body that attends mainstream universities. I know that may be true apart a certain fringe, I think, within those universities. The vast majority of students want a degree that will enable them to get a job somewhere in business. That's primarily why the majority of students are attending university. And the reason for that is often because they paid $18,000, $19,000 to attend university. So many of those individuals, the vast majority of students, are strongly against my methods and against my processes of decolonization. They want simple answers. In fact, majority of them want to just learn about Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. They're not absolutely not interested in anything about decolonization. Even in the core modules that we teach and that I teach on too, they are absolutely not interested. They want 90% of them want to hear about fascism and Nazism, perhaps because, I don't know, I wouldn't like to think about why they actually want to hear about that, but that's what they want to hear about, the Second World War. They don't want to hear about the deconstruction of historical narratives. They don't want to hear about the deconstruction of the Second World War. And they certainly don't want to hear about the stuff that I am researching and the stuff that I write and teach on, because it deconstructs their sense of identity and the whole basis upon which they operate. One last comment. I've also spent a considerable amount of time on decolonizing our perception of what some of you have called the transatlantic slave trade. And part of that process is that there is no such thing as a transatlantic slave trade. There is such a thing as a maafa, which is disaster. And there is such a thing as genocide. But there is no such thing as a transatlantic slave trade. Transatlantic slave trade suggests that there are two sides trading equally with an equal footing and that both sides get something from it. That is not what happened. It was a maafa. It was a disaster. It was a colonization. It was a destruction. It was not a transatlantic slave trade. And we have to get out of that terminology. The second thing is about we should try and talk about enslaved people and not slaves. The humanity of a human being remains whether they have been enslaved or not. They never become property. A property are the chairs that you're sitting on. We're sitting on things which are property. A human being never becomes that. They have an intrinsic fundamental aspect of self. So we should talk about enslaved people, not slaves. And this is a really important pedagogical curricular development.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, as you know, my background is in health, and I've researched ethnicity and health for 25 years, both in the UK and in Canada. And I think most people will be aware through media reports of the percentage of Black and minority ethnic staff that are engaged in the British National Health Service. And in fact, the National Health Service in England has been dependent on Black and minority ethnic staff to provide high quality and reliable care to patients since its inception in 1948. And the creation of the National Health Service coincided actually with the development of the British Nationality Act in 1948. So whilst the National Health Service has relied for a large extent, in relation to its development on Black and minority ethnic people, many of these individuals who came to the UK were actually British citizens when they arrived, because they had citizenship conferred on them under the British Nationality Act of 1948. So in actual fact, the National Health Service is the biggest employer of BME people in the UK. So around a third of all our doctors are from Black and minority ethnic groups, and around a fifth of all our nurses and midwives are from BME groups. And actually about a third of the NHS doctors are trained overseas. So these individuals arrived in the UK from what were former British colonies to work in the National Health Service. And in fact, their experience has been characterised by one of discrimination, unfair treatment, inequity. We have a situation, what is commonly referred to in the NHS as the Guinness effect or the cappuccino effect, meaning that many highly qualified staff are unable to progress through the ranks to the higher levels of leadership, for example. And in fact, I have researched also the experience of internationally educated nurses in Canada. And although Canada was also a colony, it has in fact utilised the notion of what Marx would call a disposable workforce to fulfil gaps in care delivery. So when there are shortages in relation to healthcare professionals, Canada has resorted to recruitment overseas, and similarly the British NHS has done the same. So my discipline and field of study has really influenced my thinking around decolonisation, especially in relation to the unfair treatment of staff, doctors, nurses, not only patients and carers and their families, but any of us who might constitute the other, as it were, in terms of the inequity of experience that has been very well documented and evidenced in both the nation states that I've worked in.
So in terms of my profession in philosophy, I would just say, put it bluntly, is very notorious for being unfriendly to not only women and people of color in person, but also the fields of study that they're interested in. So feminism, decolonization, indigenous knowledge have been severely neglected in the field. There's been much more work done in recent years to make this a more conducive field. But I'd say on the whole, having that experience of seeing the questions I want to ask, the knowledges I want to pursue devalued constantly, just made me want to pursue it more and give opportunities for current students of mine to really engage with these knowledge systems. And I've been fortunate in my graduate education at UConn to be able to pursue this, which formed the background of my own teaching. So I tried to always teach an introduction course each semester, even though I'm interested in other research questions. But a majority of students have to take a philosophy course or a humanities course to pass. And since I know this, I know they're not really interested in philosophy per se, but I can make them at least hear certain questions that they might not ever hear at the university. So for instance, I always have a whole week on the issue of settler colonialism in the United States and colonialism. So we dive into the issue of Hawaii and its illegal annexation, and then we deal with the philosophical questions about, well, if Nozick says this about death as being improper, even if it's a gift, even with the passage of time, how do you feel about settler colonialism today? And students are confronted with that question in a philosophy course, so they know that this is part of philosophy. It does have an impact on the world. It does lead to a direct confrontation with their daily lives. But as always, they can choose to ignore that question. They can choose to answer that question. But for me, that's perfectly okay, because what they can't deny is that they were asked the question. And that's how I really try to structure my introductory course, that philosophy has this potential to not only ask questions, but also answer them. But that's something that you're going to have to be willing to do. And hopefully, I think philosophy can be a conducive field. It needs a lot more work to get there, but I do see potential.
Great, wonderful. And that's going to be a great segue, Dr. Miranda, for the next question I have for our panelists. And I'm going to start with Dr. Higginbottom with the following question that one of our audience members asks us. So the question is acknowledging a decolonial past enough? What does decolonialization look like in our pedagogy? Or in other words, this person asks us to think about, how do we teach in a way that is decolonial as part of a process? How will we recognize that the acquisition of knowledge between lecturers and students will be different?
Well, I think first of all, what we need to recognise is that the higher education institutions and universities are institutions in society. And so in terms of when we talk about decolonizing the curricula and universities, it's rather a difficult thing to do, because really what we're talking about is addressing the decolonization or perspectives on decolonization in a whole society. As I mentioned in my my talk, I strongly believe that the facilitators of learning in universities need to really, we all need to address, specifically in the UK, Eurocentric history that we're taught in schools. So no, acknowledging a decolonial history past is not enough. There needs to be an awful lot of individual, group and institutional work that's implemented in order to deconstruct this Eurocentric preeminence that we hold in relation to our histories. And that is an enormous task. And I feel that if we have gone some way to deconstructing this Eurocentric perspective on history, that inevitably this will be manifested in our pedagogies. But it's not possible to, I don't feel, to decolonize the curriculum as a sort of isolated endeavour. I don't see how that's going to work in sort of presenting, let's say, a decolonized curriculum to somebody who has not worked through their own values, norms, and how their own history and how they've come to hold the beliefs that they hold. So I don't think it's an easy task. I think it's an enormous task, endeavour that we have to engage in, that is not bounded by the parameters of the university. We need to be doing this in all our educational institutions before an individual, either student or lecturer, ever arrives in the university. So I just feel that it's much bigger than just the confines of the higher education institute.
Yeah, I think that the proof of our endeavour will be in the results. I remember in the 60s, before my time somewhat, although I was born at the end of the 60s, but the 60s produced this huge belief that somehow things were going to change, that there was going to be a movement for justice and equality on several levels, not just on the question of racial equality, but upon the equality of sexual orientation, gender, and range and class too. There was a sort of movement within the 60s, a belief that somehow all those ills would just disappear. But here we are in 2020, and many of those ills have become more manifested, more institutionalized, which clearly indicates not necessarily that the method that was enacted was faulty intrinsically, but that perhaps our desire or our belief or our expectations of what we thought that it would achieve were rather naive. If we thought that hundreds of years of genocide, colonialization, neo-colonialization, destruction and sequestration of land and people and thoughts could be removed within one generation, we were very, very naive. So I think that in the same way, the outpouring of interest in equity and equality that has come about over this last year and now seems in fact to be dying away, I think, in some ways. Certainly the excitement is that if we think that this by itself is going to achieve the result that we want, I think that we are also very, very naive. I'm a believer in two things. First of all, that most of the change that has taken place in Britain in institutions is changes in the curricula that began in communities in the 60s, went through into the 70s and into the 80s, into community centers, libraries, colleges, schools, and then eventually by knocking on the door and in some cases breaking down the door, that was then introduced into universities through the back door slowly, and because the university didn't have any other choice but to accept it. That's, I'm afraid, what happened. Yeah, I know because I was part of some of those movements and I saw what happened. The things that we are talking about at university now that we claim are so fantastic and new were things in the 80s and the 70s people were talking about in their community centers, activists were implementing in community centers up and down the country. So the idea, therefore, that we will know the change has happened when we see the results. And what kind of results are we talking about? We're talking ultimately about a society that's more equitable. Does that place a huge responsibility on us? You bet it does. You bet it does. We're educators. You know, we're educators. We're responsible for our communities. We're responsible for the nation in which we live in. And I think I will be content that my job, I'm doing my job when I see manifest change in my society, and I see manifest change in this nation and manifest change in this world. I will know that a part of what I do is having benefit. It will not be enough for me simply because I've produced 1 or 2 courses that master's students take, or I've got 10 or 15 Ph.D. students to write a Ph.D. on Frantz Fanon or Amir César or whoever. I mean, that's good, but that doesn't mean that I've decolonized anything. What I will believe is positive change is when I see the world around me changing. Then I know my job as an educator is working, and then I'll be far more content with myself that I'm having a progressive effect.
I'll get to the specific question about is acknowledging decolonial past enough from the perspective of my own institution, UConn Hartford, and thinking about the importance of questioning whose past are we talking about, and the power of constructing a narrative of the United States and of American universities that ultimately whitewashes, erases the complexities, the Native American traditions, other stories of who we are as a complex and pluralistic society. So, for example, Hartford, the city, is the capital of the state of Connecticut, and it's a majority Black, brown, and immigrant city, 80+% folks. So it struck me when and this is a new campus that I direct starting 3 years ago in 2017, and when the University of Connecticut, which primarily sits in a rural space, it's a primarily white institution in the rural space of Storrs, Mansfield, Connecticut, when we determined to move to Hartford, there was not a conversation, as far as I know, around what it meant to move into this Black, brown space, a space filled with, so-called colonial subjects, right? Puerto Ricans, West Indians, this whole dynamic, immigrants, refugees, etc. And what does that mean for the enterprise of the university and engaging with those particular communities and creating knowledge in that space? So the absence of a historical knowledge of place, an absence of an understanding of the complexities of who those people are and in the space in which we reside, really created conversations around, kind of corporate languages of efficiencies and moving into the downtown core and all these things, not about how to think deeply and critically about who we are as a university and who our students are. Most of our students are, first generation minoritized students at this particular campus, distinct from the larger main campus. So this has become a fundamental question for us and for me as an administrator, how to think about that dynamic, again, to my notion of this encuentro, desencuentro, this misalignment of a university that historically has been a PWI, predominantly white serving institution, moving into this space and trying to create curricular changes, engagement with community changes, hiring, all of these pieces that Dr. Miranda talked about that we need to do to undo these colonial practices in this space. So that's been created. And the other way of thinking about this for me is, so yes, it's not enough to think historically, but it is important to think historically and then think about how we're thinking about it historically, right? So undoing that. And again, from my own field of Latin American studies, about the notion of truth and reconciliation. Right, this thinking about genocide and engaging and understanding these historical pasts and reconciling with those. So acknowledging them and reconciling is really critical, really critical. Otherwise, we can't come to the place what we hope to get in this particular moment.
Wonderful, thank you for those remarks. And we unfortunately won't have time for any more questions because there were some really deep responses to the questions that we're able to present. So I'd like to go ahead and ask our panelists to please prepare your closing remarks and share those with us. About 60 or 90 seconds with your closing remarks. I'd like to begin first with Dr. Nubia, please.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I found what we call cross-collaborative process extraordinarily beneficial. It can be extraordinarily isolating when one is developing a curricula and a pedagogy that is challenging. And therefore, it is very helpful to actually see other challengers, and I believe you all are, that are doing same or similar things in other parts of the world. It is a reminder to me, because I'm deeply rooted in a spiritual notion, not necessarily a religious notion, that the change that we are adopting is in fact beneficial for our species and ultimately is something which is spiritually edifying. I'm also bounded by the idea that I believe change is a cumulative thing. I'm against one-off things. And I'm hoping that this isn't tokenistic window dressing and that we actually move forward in collaborative ways, developing programs, moving forward with funding, developing symposiums, strategies, etc., moving forward, embedding concepts and ideas, cross-pollination of ideas, cross-pollination of ideas of mainstreaming, because we've all spoken about mainstreaming, how you mainstream. I'm very interested in that and how one mainstreams. Sharing good practice. Sharing good practice is absolutely fundamental because that's how we learn, by learning from the good practice of others. And I'm most interested in how colleagues have mainstreamed the good practice that they have initiated, and also sharing how I've mainstreamed good practice, pedagogy, and changes to curricula. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in long-term collaborative relationships that benefit myself, the University of Nottingham, and the other institutions and individuals that are here gathered, and not some sort of temporary thing that's come and gone.
So I just want to end by really reiterating what Professor Nubia said about making this a lasting connection. Again, a 500-year history of colonization, imperialism, genocide. It's a struggle to overcome. It might not even be overcome in my lifetime, but that's a commitment, not only as an educator, but also a labor of love to do the work for even future generations. So for me, this transatlantic meeting is the second of our series conversation. So we've talked about the past, we've engaged with some of the present, but I'm also looking forward to talking about future possibilities and articulations, because if we know this is a struggle that we're committed to, that requires us not only to change our curriculum, our teaching, higher education, but the world, our societies, that's going to take a lot of people, take a lot of time, take a lot of work. So I'll just say, although I mentioned that the way we've approached education, we've failed at certain moments as educators to change the world. I think it's important to note that this has been a failure, but failure also offers up many possibilities. Failure is not an end all. It doesn't end the question. It doesn't end the possibilities. And many people that have failed in the past have allowed us this opportunity to engage in this work, to be educators, to be part of higher education, to be part of the university. So with that, I just want to again say I'm very happy to be in conversation with not only my colleagues, but also the many participants, the many people in the Q&A that are engaged with this question, because they know it's a matter of life and death. They know it's a matter of the way the world functions. So again, thank you for allowing me to participate.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thanks once again to the organisers for enabling me to come and talk at the event tonight and organising the series. I want to thank the other presenters, because I think it's been marvellous to have the interdisciplinary perspectives. And I feel like you have all really extended my thinking. So I really want to thank you for that, for challenging me, because I have a lot of stuff to go away and think about, and I hope the audience does too. In respect of the topic of decolonisation, I just wish and desire that we have institutions where every individual, every student, every educator, every security man, every cleaner can actually fulfill their potential and feel safe in that environment and grow. That is my desire for this goal to decolonize our universities. We all deserve the right to fulfill our potential. We do not need to have our potential determined by others. So that's all I want to say. And I think Onyeka is correct in the sense that he says that the manifestation of the evidence will provide us with truth and veracity. Thank you.
Yeah, just to echo my colleagues' support for each other, and to thank you all and having this opportunity to learn from you all. It's been really, really wonderful, and I also look forward to continuing this. Also, building off what Dr. Miranda said, this really is a critical life and death moment, right? I think about what Dr. Nubia said again about the disease, and I've been saying to my students, so we focus a lot on the cure for the vaccine for COVID, but I think this is equally, or certainly even more so because of its pervasiveness, the need for us to find an antidote to this violence that our communities are facing. And I think particularly in my position here at the university, about my students who are particularly susceptible to this kind of disease of racism and coloniality. And so these kinds of conversations and sharing best practices are the ways that we can move forward. In particular, as you know, this kind of persistence of this violence into the future, as our societies become more filled with the so-called former harvest of empire, right? These colonial subjects, as increasingly we see in the United States. I'm guessing it's similar in the UK. Our students are more coming from the global South. So how do we then address them, feel them, have their whole selves in these kinds of places of higher education, and to do that with love and respect is certainly a challenge, but something I tried to do. Anyway, Kenny, back to you, and thanks much to all of you. It's been a real honor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to our panelists, to the organizers for putting together this wonderful series, and in particular for today's event around the urgency, around thinking around coloniality, and really the tremendously thought-provoking remarks from our panelists. In particular, thank you to the 5 of our panelists for really sharing some really interesting perspectives. So thank you very much. And thank you to all our audience members for joining us today. Thank you very much.